Next week, they'll go with that. But what that turned out to be was about 100 times worse than Macrinus. And almost immediately after the teenager history calls Elagabalus won the throne, even the legion that had been the first to support him was ready to revolt against him. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 60,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again, audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There is no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book. You can also keep going with one of their monthly subscription options and get great deals on all future audiobook purchases. This week, I'm going to recommend The Ghosts of Cannae, Hannibal, and the Darkest Hour of the Roman Republic by Robert O'Connell, an accounting not just of the battle itself, but of its generations-long impact on the course of Roman history. Just released a few days ago, you will not be surprised to learn that it has shot to the top of my reading list. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 104, Here Comes the Sun. So I need to start this week with a brief correction. In the episode before last, while I was discussing Septimius Severus' campaign in Caledonia, I mentioned that one of the lasting consequences of the war was that Severus helped reconstruct Hadrian's Wall, leading the Romans to actually call it the Severan Wall. This is not true at all. What he actually did was reoccupy and reconstruct the Antonine Wall, which had been abandoned around the time Marcus Aurelius became emperor. Roman historians did thereafter call this fortification the Severan Wall, but they never ever called Hadrian's Wall that, because Severus never ordered any major reconstruction of Hadrian's Wall. Sorry for this flub to my attention in the comments section. So, moving on. I think it's possible that in another time and place, Marcus Opellius Macrinus might have made a pretty good emperor. He was smart, able to make difficult decisions, and had always been an excellent administrator. Even the things he actually did that caused everyone to lose confidence in him proved to be more or less the right call in the long run. Wasting the empire's dwindling resources in an attempt to defend the honor of Caracalla was bad policy, and Macrinus knew it. So he refused to do it. The dead emperor had picked fights all over the place, and rather than digging in on those fights, Macrinus asked everyone to please form an orderly line, and one by one described to him the nature of their grievance with Rome. Then he gave them whatever they wanted to make the issue go away. Macrinus knew full well that in each case, Rome, that is, Caracalla, had been the guilty party, and, ever the lawyer, he knew that it would be far more damaging for these things to go to trial than to just settle out of court right now. But things get tricky when it's an emperor committing needlessly provocative crimes. Because when an emperor does something, it is Rome doing something. And so, like it or not, when you refuse to defend Caracalla's honor, it looks very much like you were refusing to defend Rome's honor. And in the honor-crazy classical world, that was simply not acceptable. In trying to mop up after Caracalla, Macrinus was making Rome look weak, spineless, and even cowardly. I think it is fair to say that, as the old saying goes, most Roman leaders would rather be strong and wrong than weak and right. Weak and right may mean right today, but it also means that they'll think they can push you around tomorrow. Strong and wrong means that everyone is still afraid to mess with you. Macrinus chose to be weak and right, and as a result, he was not long for the throne. But still, I think Macrinus might have survived and even thrived had he not had two big factors working against him. Factors that another emperor, say Hadrian, who also brazenly ignored everyone's notion of being strong, did not have to deal with. First, Macrinus was essentially a usurper, without anything resembling a claim to the throne, legal, sentimental, or otherwise. It had always been hard to toss aside even ridiculously terrible emperors like Commodus or Caligula, because they came with a lofty imperial pedigree. But tossing aside a man without history and of such low rank like Macrinus, just say the word. Second, by this point in Roman history, the discipline of the rank-and-file troops had deteriorated to the point that honor and duty took a backseat to cash and prizes. I think their general attitude during the 3rd century is best summed up in a quote from the inimitable Dwight K. Schrute. I feel like part of what I'm being paid for here is my loyalty, but if there were somewhere else that valued loyalty more highly, I'm going wherever they valued loyalty the most. Once the legions decided that someone else was going to value their loyalty more than Macrinus, his days were numbered. After a year spent paying off Rome's enemies, while simultaneously refusing calls to pay off Rome's armies, Macrinus left the door wide open for someone to step forward and challenge his claim to the throne. In the spring of 218, that challenger appeared right on cue. Caracalla's maternal aunt, Julia Maesa, aided immeasurably by a crafty eunuch named Gannys, had spent the few months they had been in exile working single-mindedly to get her family back into power. She quickly recognized Macrinus' two big weaknesses, his lack of any real claim to the throne and his perceived stiffing of the soldiers, and exploited both to the hilt. To attack the first weak point, she announced that her grandson, Varius Avidius Bassianus, who I will call Elagabalus from here on out, was actually the son of Caracalla, and thus was the only man in the empire with a legitimate claim to the throne. To attack the second weak point, she simply promised that any legion supporting her grandson would be rewarded handsomely for the trouble. On May 16, 218 AD, the 3rd Legion, stationed in Syria, decided to roll the dice and openly declared their loyalty to the true emperor, young Elagabalus. When Macrinus learned of the rebellion, he immediately dispatched a sizable contingent of his Praetorian legions to nip the rebellion in the bud. But when messengers arrived back to report on what had happened, Macrinus was shocked to learn that rather than cowing the 3rd Legion and taking Elagabalus into custody, the Praetorian rank-and-file had instead joined the uprising. Themselves as disappointed in Macrinus as anyone, the Praetorian soldiers had turned on the senior officers and killed them before declaring their loyalty to Elagabalus. Now, suddenly, Macrinus had a full-blown crisis on his hands. He scrambled to keep the rest of the legions in line, and belatedly promised them the lavish donatives he had thus far been holding back. But it was too little, too late. The 2nd Legion saw which way the winds were blowing, and defected to Elagabalus soon after the Praetorian Mutiny. Now Elagabalus controlled 2 full legions, as well as the cream of the Praetorian Guard. The fact that all the rest of the legions in the empire were still nominally with him was cold comfort to Macrinus, because in the microcosm of Syria, where a major confrontation was now inevitable, he was about to be outnumbered. About 3 weeks after the 3rd Legion declared for Elagabalus, that final confrontation arrived. Outside of Antioch, Macrinus gathered what troops he could still muster to fight for him, and lined them up against the legions of Elagabalus, who were led into battle by the eunuch Gannys. In the ensuing battle, the two sides were pretty evenly matched, but the superior command of Gannys won out against the less capable Macrinus. There is still some debate as to whether the battle in and of itself should have been decisive. After all, Macrinus still had the rest of the empire with him. He had even convinced the Senate to declare Elagabalus and Julia Maesa. Whatever their personal feelings towards Macrinus, the legions of the West may not have been as keen on backing a 14-year-old Syrian boy as the Eastern legions had been. But in the battle, 2 things happened. First, Elagabalus apparently displayed a degree of courage during the fight, and had rallied a flagging cavalry charge, while second, in contrast, Macrinus had fled the field the minute things began to go against him. This only deepened the impression that Macrinus was a coward, and whatever little faith people were still willing to invest in him fled the field along with the emperor. The now disgraced Macrinus tried to flee back to Rome to regroup, but he was caught by agents of the Severans in Cappadocia and executed. He was 58 years old and had ruled the empire for just 14 months. This left Rome in the hands of 14-year-old Elagabalus. With no other viable candidate stepping forward, and with amnesty promised the Senate, who had, after all, just declared him a public enemy, the senators accepted the legitimacy of the boy shortly after the Severan victory at Antioch. Now, we often call young Elagabalus the first Eastern-born emperor, but in fact, he was half Syrian, half African, just like Caracalla and Geta had been. The reason he is often saddled with this distinction is that because, unlike any of his predecessors, this new emperor was culturally Eastern. Wherever they came from originally, the men who became emperor, by the time they became emperor, were fully Roman in their manner of speech and dress and tastes. But not Elagabalus. He was truly a Syrian, something the Romans back in Rome were about to find out. After the defeat of Macrinus, Elagabalus and his entourage, or should I say at this point, Julia Maesa and her entourage, which included Elagabalus, took their sweet time making the trip back to the capital. They passed the winter of 218-219 in Bithynia, and only with the autumn of 219 approaching, more than a year after the initial revolt of the Third Legion, did they arrive in Rome. But to prepare the Romans, and the Senate especially, for the coming of their new master, a portrait of Elagabalus had been delivered to the capital, with instructions to hang it in the Senate house, where it would oversee all proceedings. The picture was mostly meant to help them all recognize Elagabalus when he finally arrived, as most people had no idea what he looked like. But all the senators saw was a horrifying glimpse of what was to come. The portrait showed Elagabalus dressed in silken robes, adorned with rings and other jewelry, and is that makeup? Is that kid wearing eyeliner? Though Roman austerity had long ago been vanquished by the might of luxury and decadence, there were still a few old taboos rattling around, and a man wearing silk robes and makeup was definitely on that list. But appearances aside, the Senate was also inflamed by Elagabalus' disregard for another taboo. Traditionally, the key powers invested in the emperor, the tribunician authority, the proconsular superauthority, were just that, invested in the emperor by the Senate. Whether it was an exercise in rubber stamping was beside the point. The emperor had to ask, and the Senate had to give. In assuming power, though, Elagabalus and his advisors had not asked. More steeped in the traditions of Oriental despotism than they were in the traditions of the Roman Senate, the men surrounding the new emperor had simply declared that Elagabalus now held all the powers of imperial office. This rankled the Senate to no end. Coupled with the disturbing portrait of the Syrian dandy hanging on the wall, well, let's just say that the reign of Elagabalus was not getting off to a great start. And it wasn't just the stuffed shirts in the Senate who